Good morning. My name is William Sangre and I am a deacon in the Diocese of Southern Ohio. I work in the healthcare field as a hospice chaplain primarily, but today I'm coming to you with part of my other expertise, which is as a analytical geochemist. My degree is from Cornell University, and I have spent over a decade teaching at the college level. My talk today is going to be focused on the geology of the Holy Land and how it impacts the region and also our interpretation of Holy Scriptures and what we read and study in God's Word. It is obviously a very vast topic. I don't want to pretend that I'm going to cover the entire thing in a 15-minute lecture. What I would encourage you to do, if you're interested, is to learn more about it, is to read some of the books I might reference or other materials that you'll find available. The area that we refer to as the Holy Lands, the Middle East, is a very diverse part of our planet, not only in terms of the people, the religions, and the inhabitants, but the land itself. It is easy to overlook the varied climates, landscapes, and even the very earth that underlies this area. This small portion of the Middle East is marked by deserts, which are subject to drought. Many parts of this area see very little rainfall, like the Negev, the Arabian and Saharan deserts. It is also marked by mountains and valleys. There are mountains of at least very hilly areas, parts of the Sinai Peninsula, Lebanon, Western Arabia, Turkey, and of course there's the deep valleys such as the Jordan and the Dead Sea. We know that the area has some very significant rivers, the Nile, the Jordan, among others. But more importantly, there are even small washes, streams, the wadis that we see referred to. These areas are subject to flash floods during the rare but very torrential rainfalls. The area has many earthquakes, areas such as Turkey, Asia Minor, the Jordan Valley, Ethiopia, Iran. Earthquakes are a common occurrence, and they are potentially very devastating. And the area is also home to regions with volcanic activities. We see cinder cones, lava flows, and even other volcanic landforms, hot springs, indications that the interior of the earth is unstable. When we look at this from our modern time frame, we have the framework of plate tectonics, the modern understanding of geology, to formulate our opinions. The basics of the theory of plate tectonics is that the crust of the earth is divided into segments, plates. These plates are pieces of the crust which in essence float over a semi-molten mantle, an interior of the planet. The movement of these plates in relation to each other, driven by this internal earth heat, is expressed in one of three different ways. If you think of it, you have two plates. They can either bump into each other, move apart from each other, or slide past each other. Each of these type of boundaries is characterized by a specific type of geology. Those that pull apart are where we find new crusts being created, the mid-ocean ridges, for example. Areas where they're coming together are areas where we have convergence. We have mountain ranges, volcanoes. And the areas which slide past each other are areas that are characterized by major earthquakes, such as the San Andreas Fault in California. Our understanding of the interior plate tectonics coalesced in the middle of the last century. So in our modern time period, we can explain the geologic phenomena that we see. But in the biblical times, obviously, plate tectonics was not known. All the people of those eras knew is they could see and experience the phenomena, but they did not know exactly why they were occurring. So what happens is that we find that the geologic phenomena are described in the Bible in great detail, and we can readily identify the connections that were the people's way of explaining what the earth around them was doing. For example, when we're dealing with the deserts and areas that underwent extreme droughts, we now know that this is due to the climate changes of associated with wind patterns, rain, the rain shadows of mountains. But the biblical people, as you can see on this screen, were writing about it, describing what was happening to them, whether it's in the writings of Hosea or the Psalms describing the desert wastes. Or of course, the writings of Isaiah are strewn with references to the wilderness and the desert. Even Jesus, in Matthew's Gospel, is described as being taken out into a desert to be tempted by the devil. There's many, many other examples within the Pentateuch and the Old and other parts of the Old and New Testament that describe deserts. But it's not just deserts that we find there. We also find references to the mountains and the valleys. And as you see on the screen, there's some of the quotations in the Bible that relate to biblical mountains, biblical valleys. Topography plays a significant part in the narratives. Mountaintops are often described as sacred sites. People go up to the mountains, go up to the top of the mountains to have an experience, to be closer to God. Green valleys are often referred to as paradise. Lands of milk and honey are almost always lush green valleys. The 23rd Psalm makes reference to a green valley. We hear references to rivers and floods, where the flooding, not just Noah's flood, but we hear floods described as coming up out of nowhere and washing people away. The descriptions in the Bible are really descriptions of flash floods, which are very common in those dry desert wadis and other intermittent streams that are very common in the Middle East. We find these references to streams and floods in the laments of the Psalms. All of this is people describing the world around them and how it impacts their lives. And of course we have the earthquakes. Earthquakes are a significant geologic phenomenon, readily identifiable in the Bible. We hear about earthquakes in the time of creation, during the flood, in relation to Sodom and Gomorrah, the giving of the law in Mount Sinai in Exodus. When the walls of Jericho fell, the earth shook. The crucifixion and resurrection of our Lord was associated with an earthquake, splitting the rocks, opening the tomb. Paul was imprisoned in Philippi, in chains, when an earthquake ripped open the jail and he was freed. And of course in Revelation there are many references to earthquakes and the shaking of the earth at the second coming of the Lord. And last of my list of geologic phenomena is the volcanic activity. We hear references to Sodom and Gomorrah, where sulfur and fire rain down from the sky. The smell of sulfur and raining fire is very, very common in pyroclastic eruptions when the earth spews out volcanic rock and lava. It has been proposed that the references to the burning bush, where fire was coming out of the earth but did not consume the bush, might be a description of a volcanic fumarole, a vent that allows volcanic gases to come out. Sir Colin Humphreys, a professor at Cambridge in England, in his book, The Miracles of Exodus, a scientist's discovery of extraordinary natural causes for the biblical stories, suggested that possibly Mount Sinai was a volcano, an area where the smoke, the lightning, were associated with some sort of an eruption from the people down below looking up at the coming of God. All of these geologic phenomena, as they are described in the Bible, have an impetus or a connection with the earth, where the people were living, were being, were existing. But what are the implications for Exodus of the geology? The first thing in Exodus, when we look at a map, is we realize that nobody knows exactly what the route was. We know for sure from the description that the people left Egypt, left the Nile River Valley, and made their way east. We also know that they did not take the coast road, which was the easiest and most direct route, but it was also the flattest and the easiest for chariots. And if you are refugees trying to escape a pursuing power like Pharaoh's army, you're not going to go down the road. You're going to go the most difficult way for the chariots, which would have been to go south up through the mountains of Sinai. We also know that just based on geography, the trek, if they had gone direct, was not a 40-year walk. God had other plans for the people of Israel and had other things that they had to do. But still, the people that left went east. We're not sure where, we're not sure how, but they were heading out of the land of Egypt. One of the biggest implications for going out of Egypt into the Sinai is that you are leaving a land that is very lush, the Nile River Valley, and heading out into a desert. If you look at this picture, you can clearly see the Nile Delta and the Nile River itself show up lush, green, verdant, a land where there is plenty to eat, plenty to drink. And if you look at Sinai, it's brown in this satellite photo. There's not a lot of water there. There's even less vegetation. So when we read in Exodus of the people coming up to Moses and complaining about where's our food, where's our drink, it's clearly based in the geology of Sinai. It's not there. They have to trust in God. A last implication of Exodus, based on the geology, is where is Mount Sinai? There is a mountain on the Sinai Peninsula that has the name Mount Sinai. But that's a modern name. Is that the Mount Sinai that the Bible refers to? It's difficult to tell. Some places, like Jerusalem, has had that name forever. Other places, we're not so sure. In the case of Mount Sinai, the areas that have been proposed generally are in the southern highlands of the Sinai Peninsula. But it has been proposed that Mount Sinai might not actually be in the Sinai Peninsula. Dr. Glenn Fritz, who has studied the geology and the environment surrounding the area, has suggested, among others, that Mount Sinai might actually be, the biblical Mount Sinai might actually be located in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, why did he say this? He said this primarily because that part of Arabia is characterized by volcanic mountains. The Sinai Mountains are not volcanic. And he is suggesting that if in fact the clouds of the power of God were related to some sort of a volcanic eruption, that Mount Sinai may be further east. He's also suggested that the sea that they crossed was the Gulf of Abaca, not the Red Sea or some ocean as suggested by others. Do we know for sure that either of these locations of Mount Sinai is correct? The answer, of course, is no. There is no way we can know that any of the described locations within the Bible are exactly correct. What we do know is that the descriptions in Exodus and the other books of the Bible are talking about a people who were journeying from captivity to the promised land of Canaan. We know that these people endured a great journey, hardship and challenges. We know that they were dealing with not only the emotional challenges, but they were also dealing with the physical nature of the world around them. We do know that there was a struggle, and we do know that the people overcame and eventually found their way, after 40 years, to the promised land. Does knowing the exact locations described in Exodus change our faith? That's a question that each of us must answer for ourselves. Thank you for your time. I hope this little presentation on the geology of the Middle East has given you a new insight into the challenges faced by the people of Israel. Each Sunday when we open scriptures, we need to remember that these were real people who were living in a real world. dealing with challenges just like you and I. And I hope that this talk has given you a new insight to some of the challenges they may have endured. Thank you and God bless.